my sister-in-law is Black. I'm not a racist because we have adopted Black children in our family. And so we're quick to point out that we're not a racist, but it's an individual thing, the way we put it. It's still very personal, still very individual. And her thing is that racism is baked into the system, that is a systemic thing. It's not an individual thing or a personal thing. When 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 I was young, we used to have this park in Kansas City called Swope Park, and we'd go there for the 4th of July and Memorial Day, and for picnics and things. And when I was very little, I remember the park being segregated, and they had a community swimming pool there. And one thing they would do is they would segregate the swimming pool, and you could swim. The pool was closed on Mondays for cleaning. So white people would swim in the pool from Tuesday to, I think it was Saturday. And then Saturday and Sunday, Black people could swim. And then on Monday, they would close the pool and change the water. Jeez. And that's how they would do it. And it's Black people's lives are full of little slights like that. And Robin DiAngelo says that racism is not an event, it's a system. And by that she means it's not a one-time thing that happens to you. It's a whole system of oppression that is working on you all the time. You all remember Amy Cooper, the woman in the park in New York City, where the guy wanted her to leash her dog and she wouldn't leash her dog. And she called the cops on him right there and said that there was a Black man threatening her in the park. That was a one-time thing. That was an event. And it goes the way events usually go. They either people drop it or they do something with it. And in her case, she eventually apologized to him and he eventually accepted. And that's how events go. But systemic oppression, which is baked into the system, never ends. It just goes and goes and goes. I remember when I was a kid, I asked my mother if Black people and white people had ever been to war. And I think I had been watching like, World War I movies or something. And she said, no, why do you ask? And I said, well, they don't like us. And I just want to know why. What did we do to them? And she said, we didn't do anything to them. She said, that's just the way it is. And I think that was her way of saying, it's a system. It's not an event. We used to play this, when I did these workshops in person, there's this game we used to play called the institution game. And you name off all the institutions we have, like medical, the media, legal, banking, education, so forth. There's about 12 of them. And you name them all. And that's where most of us make our living, in those institutions. And so the game went like this. We have people make a circle. We get 2 volunteers, have the volunteers go out of the room. And then I would tell everybody in the circle to whatever you do, don't let these 2 people in the circle. But at the same time, invite them to be in the circle. And so that's what we would do. I'd call them in, I'd call the 2 people in, and I'd tell them to my instructions to them were to get into the circle no matter what. And depending on how young the crowd was, it could get pretty rowdy, it could get into wrestling, it could get into trying to be slick with it, trying to coerce their way in, whatever, going up to people they know. But they didn't get in the circle. And that was to let people know that this is what systemic oppression is like. It's like there's a circle, you're invited in, but they're not going to let you in. And so that's what that game was, to show that you can't, there's a system there. It's not accidental that you can't get in. And there are things that keep the system going. And one of the first things to keep the system going, in fact, the creation of the system, was slavery. And slavery was basically free labor. And I think it would be more tolerable for people, instead of calling it slavery, you just called it free labor, although slavery kind of creates the picture of the mistreatment and stuff. But free labor is what it was all about. These people working for free. And it would be like, to me, it would be like Amazon. If Amazon used free labor, with all the money Amazon's making, if they used free labor, think how much more they could make. And so that's what slavery is about too. You follow the money. Slavery was a money-making proposition, and it kept the South in the game of money, because that money went everywhere. It didn't just stay in the South. It went north, it went west, it went east, it went everywhere. And, it gave the South a lot of power and a lot of prestige, because that's where the money was going. And the money was being made off of cotton, what they used to call king cotton. And they didn't hate Black people. They just needed a way to make money. I mean, it was just their way of making a living. And so it had nothing to do with how they felt about us, but it had everything to do with making money. Some of you are familiar with the Mississippi Delta and what that implies today, which is total poverty. And when you think of the Mississippi Delta, I think of all the blues players that came through that came out of the Mississippi Delta: Muddy Waters, Robert Johnson, Sonny Boy Williamson, these people, these blues people who came out of the abject poverty of the Mississippi Delta. Well, back during the 17 and 1800s, the Mississippi Delta was one of the richest places in the world, let alone the country, but one of the richest places in the world. And the slave owners wanted to keep up, the business people wanted to keep up the status quo. And so they did everything they could to keep the slaves there and to work with the slaves. So that's one thing we had to deal with, is slavery. And to make sure that slaves stayed in their place, because I've talked to a lot of people who say, well, why didn't the slaves leave? Why didn't the slaves run away? Well, they passed this law called the Dred Scott Law, which meant if you found a slave anywhere outside of the South, that slave didn't have any rights, and that you didn't have to, the slave was not really a citizen. It had no rights, and it had no, the slave couldn't vote or anything like that. And that was called the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was the name of this guy who left the South and went to Wisconsin, and thought he would be free, but they passed the law saying he couldn't be. And then there's the Virginia slave law, which is basically saying if you catch a slave, you can return that slave back and you'd get some money, but you could beat the slave, just don't kill him, and send the slave back, and you would get the money. And the next thing that we deal with was the Civil War, and the whole point of the Civil War was to keep the slaves, because Lincoln wanted to free the slaves, and the whole point of the Civil War was to keep the slaves. And the South wanted it to, they made it out like it was something else other than about slavery. They talked about states' rights and that sort of thing. But the reality of it is about slavery. And why else would you send your uncles and your fathers and your sons off to kill and die if it wasn't to maintain that way of life? And they were dedicated to that way of life, living the way they did with slaves, functioning at every level in their well-being, you know, maids, butlers, gardeners, whatever you needed. You had free labor there to do it, and they were dedicated to that. And if you've ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind, you kind of get an idea of what that's like, that lifestyle that they had, which was very lavish, built around slavery. And then around 1865, the Black Codes came into effect. And the Black Codes were basically slave patrol, which eventually turned into the police. But slave patrol was basically to find the people who had run away and to bring them back. And so that's what slave patrol was about, keeping the slaves slaves. And then from 1865 to 77, Reconstruction came, and Reconstruction was progressive. And the Republicans at that time were the liberals, and the Republicans were making sure that that slavery that South couldn't continue with slavery. And so they passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And the 13th Amendment got rid of slavery. The 14th Amendment made everybody a citizen. And the 15th Amendment was about voting. Some people call these the Black Amendments, but they were for all immigrants, really. And but anyway, that was the progressive movement that was going on during Reconstruction. And then Reconstruction ended in 1877, but it really ended when Lincoln was assassinated. And then his vice president took over, Andrew Johnson, and he was a Southerner, and he made sure that none of Lincoln's things got passed. So that's what that was his thing, to make sure none of Lincoln's things got passed. Lincoln had this thing where he had gotten this bill passed where every slave could get 40 acres and a mule. And there were slaves who had gotten their 40 acres and a mule. And they lived like that with their 40 acres and a mule for about 7 months. And then Andrew Johnson came along and took it all away and gave that land to the Confederacy. And so once again, the systemic oppression pulls things away from Black people. And they do it not because they hate Black people, but because they want their lifestyle back, that lifestyle that gave them luxury and money. So, and then after that, in 1877, that's when the KKK came about. And the whole point of the KKK was to frighten white people and to frighten Black people and to force them back on the plantations. And they did this by any means necessarily, but basically by trying to threaten and scare Black people into submission. The whole point of the white capes, which I didn't know, of the white capes was to symbolize the ghost of dead Confederates. And they assumed that Black people were afraid of ghosts. And so they would don these white capes and go around in the hoods and things and go around and terrorize Black people with burning, lynching, all of that kind of thing. The next thing that came about in the 1870s through the 1850s was sharecropping. And sharecropping was you worked the land, but you didn't get any of the benefits. You just worked the land. You didn't get any of the money from the land. You didn't get to live where you wanted on the land. You lived in these shacks that were already there. And that was another way of keeping Blacks out of the institution. And then came Jim Crow from 1877 to the 1950s. Jim Crow was basically legalized segregation. And the whole thing, they said it was separate but equal, but there was no equality to it since Blacks didn't have the resources that the white population had. And so there were segregated restaurants, segregated water fountains, segregated schools, segregated graveyards even. There was this thing that, because Black people found some of this stuff just crazy and just funny. And someone came up with this word called mad-larious, which was, it made you mad, but it was so crazy, it was funny, so it was hilarious. So they came up with mad-larious. And one of the things that made people laugh was segregated graveyards. It just didn't make any sense at all, but that's how far it went. Even in the courthouse, when you swore on the Bible, they had a Black Bible and a white Bible that you could swear on. And so that was a certain amount of just craziness. And then came redlining in 1934. And redlining was, the bankers would literally draw a red line on a map and said that Black people lived on this side and white people lived on this side. And the Black people, their houses weren't worth as much as the houses on the white side. And if you went to the bank for a loan, they would only give you a loan for the housing on the red side if you were Black. And that's why they called it redlining, because you'd only get housing on the other side of that red line. So that was another way of not letting Blacks in the system. And then came the prison industrial complex, which seems to be the most brutal to me. But in the prison industrial complex, they're always trying to get people, move people into our prison system. And and you get terms like DWB, driving while Black, the war on drugs, stop and frisk, 3 strikes, you're out. All of these things are a way of gathering up Black people and putting them away. Black men are twice as likely to have an altercation with the police as white men. And one of the things that really demonstrated that to us is, of course, George Floyd. But that demonstrated it to the rest of the world, but Black people already knew about that. And brutality against Black people by the police has been going on for decades, as far back as the Black Panthers. At the beginning was all about police brutality. And that was in the 60s. And of course, it goes way back longer than that. But that was one of my first realizations about police brutality, was the Black Panthers and what that was about, trying to put an end to police brutality. And of course, when you're in prison, you only make the money you make goes from about 23 cents to $1.15 an hour. That's kind of the range of money you make in prison, which is in its own way slavery all over again, because you make that money in prison, but then everything you get, you have to pay for. You buy, you go to the commissary and you buy toilet paper, or you buy shaving cream, or whatever you buy, you have to pay for it. And it's, you pay regular price for it. So you don't save any money in prison, and you're making so little. So it's, it is slavery all over again. The thing about this, all of this stuff that I mentioned, is that it ensures that white people never have to compete with Black people. You're never competing on an equal level with Black people because of this systemic racism. Because, you can walk down the street and pass a Black person, and you can be sure that that person has probably less education than you do, probably less money than you do, probably lives in housing that is less standard. The standard is lower than what yours is. And that's the thing that all of this stuff guarantees, is that white people always have more and the best of everything to people of color. And for people of today, my question is, why is that? I mean, why do you need that? What do you get out of it? This systemic oppression of white people. And in a few minutes, I'll talk about what you can do to help that out. So, and all of this stuff morphs. I mean, every generation, there's a new way of keeping Black people down, keeping Black men out of the system. And it mostly affects men from 14 to 54, men who are of working age. And that's when it gets more brutal. The cops get more brutal. The opportunities become scarce and less. So no, you've never really had to compete with a Black person toe to toe who has as much as you do, or is equal to you. Even the GI Bill, which is supposed to help people move up, give people a leg up after serving in the military. Most Black people at the time, the GI Bill doesn't do them any good, because no bank will loan to them if they're in if they're in one of the red line districts. And that's the whole point of the GI Bill, is to give you money for a loan so you can get housing. But that bill is cut short for Black people because nobody wants to give people who live in red line areas a house, a loan. So if a person gets a house, say they pay $30,000 for it in 1950, and by 1970, that house is worth $300,000. That's how it goes. Your house is your investment. That's where your money is for a lot of people. But for Black people, you buy your house for, say, $10,000 or $12,000 in 1950. And by 1970, that house is only worth maybe $14,000.
Yeah.
You don't get the equity on that house because you're in the red line district, and those houses are usually not worth as much. So those are the kind of things that Black people have to deal with. Those are the kind of things that systemic oppression, and our society is always morphing into that. I'll give a list of what white people got out of the system. Every European in this country that came here in this country got 715 free acres of land, or very cheap acres of land. For every slave a person owned, they could get 150 acres of free land. The country, all in all, gave 2 billion acres of land to immigrants. 87% of our money now is in inheritance, and which means that, you know, no one can get at it. It's in inheritance. Blacks own only 1% of rural land. My grandfather had a farm in Terrell, Texas, and when he left the farm, he had dementia, and we never got a cent of money for that farm. We have no idea what happened, if he sold it and kept the money, or if there were no records. We couldn't find anything. My parents couldn't find anything in terms of the money for that property. And stuff like that was going on all the time in rural areas. And so that's why Blacks only own 1% of rural land. Here are some solutions. There's this guy that I like named Noel Ignatov. And his whole theory, he wrote the book When the Irish Were Black, talking about when the Irish first came to America. They were the Black people, but over the years of being a part of cop culture, they worked themselves out of that and became regular white Americans. Because everybody who comes to America eventually learns you want to be white. So, and in some cultures like the Hispanic culture, they talk about marrying lighter. So you go up, the lighter you are, the higher up the food chain you become. So everybody knows that when you come to America, you want to marry up, marry white, marry bright. But he says we should abolish whiteness, get rid of whiteness, not white people. He says it's like royalty. If you want to get rid of royalty, you don't go and kill the king and the queen and that kind of stuff. You take away their land, you take away their resources that they got for free or took from other countries. That's what you do. And he says, that's what whites should be about doing. Another thing he talks about is quit pretending that white supremacy doesn't exist, because it does exist. And you know it exists. And you take advantage of it. So quit pretending. He also talks about quit teaching lies to our children, lies about all of these statues that are coming down. The people who are pulling those statues down are very aware that those statues are lies. They represent lies. And they're saying, we don't want to be lied to anymore. And also he says that you need to understand, or people need to be aware, that whiteness is a club, and expose that club and its privileges. Whiteness is a club that has privileges. And as white people, your job is to expose that club and be a witness, not just an ally. Be a witness. And what witnesses do is they hear things, they tell people what they hear, tell people what they see, take video like the kids in the I shouldn't call them kids, but like the people who were protesting. They took pictures. They had absolute pictures of the brutality of the cops, and so and what the cops were doing to people. They had proof right there on camera, and that's what Black people, white people should do. And another thing they should do is fight for reparations. Show me the money, basically, is what Black people are saying. Reparations is about payback, because one of the things you took from Black people was money, the ability to earn a living, and that should be given back to Black people. And then I'll end with this. Racism isn't a social issue, but a financial issue. Martin Luther King said that he felt by focusing so much on the social issue of racism that he led people to a burning house. Towards the end of his life, he and Malcolm X both talked about economic justice, and that that's a justice that we should be working for. When he did the Poor People's March in Selma, and people were walking around with those signs that said, "I am a man," he did that for economic justice. That was his push for economic justice when he did that, the Poor People's March. In 1963, when he spoke at the Washington Memorial, he did his, everyone remembers the I Have a Dream speech, but he talked about economic, he talked about economic things in that speech too. He talked about a canceled check, that America had written Black people a bad check, and he had come to collect on it. And as Christians, economic justice is all throughout Scripture. And one of the things that strikes me the most is that our Lord's Prayer, which we say whenever we get together on Sundays, is all about social justice, or partially about social justice. First of all, it's plural. It's everybody. It's all of us. It talks about daily bread, and earth as it is in heaven, and our Creator, your kingdom come. All of this is about social justice. It's social justice. It's not just me and mine, but it's our. And I'll end with that. It's our that concerns me, that we're working on. Any questions?
Feel, feel free to unmute yourself to ask Pastor Vallon questions, and we are recording because there are some people who've requested to see this. If you have a question that you don't want recorded, just tell me in the chat and we'll save some time at the end to stop recording and to have those questions come forward too. And we will end at 9:55 so that we can all log off and finish this recording and then log back on for church because they have to make them 2 separate recordings.
I just wanted to make a comment. Some time ago, I read a book called The Warmth of Other Suns, which was the migration of African Americans from the South to the northern cities. And they talked about one of the storytellers was a train porter, and he talked about Jim Crow in the South, but when he moved to the North, it became a little more genteel. It became what he called James Crow, and I thought that was very illustrative.
Yeah, everybody participated in it. It wasn't just the South. The South was more blatant about it because they were more desperate because their way of life was more threatened. But the South didn't keep slavery going all by itself. You know, everybody participated in it.
Rolanda, you talked about redlining, and that is something that I had personally experienced in Brooklyn. The neighborhood that I grew up in was called Bay Ridge. And in '65, it got redlined by the realtors and the politicos, where my section of Bay Ridge was now called Sunset Park. And there is an actual Sunset Park. It was about 3 blocks away from where I grew up. But that area of Sunset Park was primarily apartments, row houses, and now was being occupied from the late 40s with Latinos, primarily Puerto Rican or Caribbean Latinos. And so we got redlined. And there was a big difference. And there is the Bay Ridge, but it's just south of Sunset Park. So that was an interesting experience. It does have a very benign separation kind of impact on people.
Verlon, this is Betty, can you talk a little bit about like the difference for us here in Seattle? I'm gonna, I'm ashamed to say that when I went to Baltimore to go to graduate school in Baltimore from Seattle, I'd been a public health nurse. I'd lived in Papua New Guinea, so I'd lived among people that were, you know, everybody's Black, but I was the person in privilege, of course. But when I went to Baltimore, I felt like my first experience was, wow, we don't have this kind of racism in Seattle. But Baltimore at the time in the early 90s, it wasn't diverse. It was Black and white. And it felt like nobody else but Black and white people. And, but the conflict and the tension was like on everybody's sleeves all the time, and you really felt it. And it was a good experience for me. I learned a lot about that and was awakened to a lot that I didn't realize sort of existed. And my first thought was like, wow, we don't have this in Seattle. And then, you know, ultimately I realized, no, we do. It's just all, you know, under the rug, and it's not talked about. And it's maybe this genteel James Crow or whatever. But it took me, you know, I'm ashamed how long it took me to sort of put that all together and to realize how that existed in Seattle. Seattle. without my full awareness. And I think that's a good thing about the protests, et cetera, now, is it sort of brings it to the forefront. But I mean, can you talk a little bit about that? You know, how that holds us back maybe in Seattle or in places like this?
The thing about it is that in Seattle, Black people are outnumbered, which isn't the case in Baltimore. And there's buffers in Seattle. You got Asian people, you got Native people. That kind of buffers things in Seattle. You don't have that in Baltimore. Like you said, it's just black and white. And the cops are there to keep the Blacks in line. The Blacks resent the cops for that. There are things there that are clearly racist, meant to keep Black people out. And Black people are aware of that, and that's resentment. So the resentment is real and blatant in Baltimore. But here in Seattle, like I say, you got the buffers, and there's less of us than there are. It's not even close to being as many Black people here as there is in Baltimore. So that all of that makes a difference.
But the buffer is, would the buffer be considered a good thing, that it helps kind of protect, or that it's a cover up, it covers it up?
Well, it's kind of both. I mean, Native people have their issues, Asian people have their issues, and they're working with it. And so it's not all focused on Black people and our issues. It's not a battle between Blacks and whites necessarily here in Seattle. And many of the Black people in Seattle have, just have, what's the word I'm looking for? Mixed in with the whites in Seattle. There's less of that in Baltimore. There's no mixing in Baltimore in general. You're either Blacks hang with Blacks, whites hang with whites, and Seattle doesn't have that. But another place that used to be like Seattle but has changed is Minnesota. When I was in Minnesota 30 years ago, it was nothing for me to go somewhere and be the only Black person. And Blacks, were intermingling with whites and that sort of thing. But as people moved in from Indiana and Chicago and Nebraska and all those places like that, it became more and more white, Blacks, and the tension grew. And then you had the whole George Floyd thing, and you're like wondering, when did those people get so angry about racism in Minnesota, of all places? Minnesota, nice, but that was the reasoning, because there had been more and more Blacks, and the competition was stiffer.
Verlon, you had said that in your presentation a lot that the whites didn't hate the Blacks, that it was just disrupting their way of life. But to me, there was hatred. I mean, from what I've read, it's hard for me to condone and it's hard for me to condone and say that there wasn't hatred with some of the actions that were taken. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, it didn't start out as hatred. It became hatred when they needed to rationalize how they were treating Black people. But in the beginning, it was just business. It's like the mafia. It's just business. But I'm about to kill you and put you in cement blocks. But yeah, it didn't start off as hatred, and it became hatred because how else you know, if you're black, how else can you explain it? You're not benefiting from the business, so it's not business for you. It seems like hate, and you know, it turned into hate over the years. But I think in the beginning, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't hate. It was business. But you can't keep treating people like that and not experience their hate, which in turns, you know, makes you hate them.
I'm curious, sort of to dovetail on what Betty was talking about, and Verlon, your point about like Minnesota 30 years ago looked like Seattle in terms of the number of black folks to white folks and the change over time. And this idea of the buffer. I wonder what are, and I don't know if anybody knows this answer, what are, in terms of Seattle, statistics are for black folks. You know, there's, do we hold the 1 in 4 black men are incarcerated in this region like it is for the country? Or you know, I've been told from our school, I think I've said this before, that we're in the top 10 of the country of having the worst outcomes for our young black males, that opportunity gap. So even though we have fewer numbers and we don't see the tension as big, I wonder how those statistics compare from our city to other cities. I don't know if anybody has an idea about that.
I would say we have to consider the different regions in the state. I know that when I lived in Spokane in the 80s, when I was attending Gonzaga, the anti-black sentiment was, well, one, we had the neo-Nazis living just across the border in Idaho, and they came into Spokane and they were active throughout the Spokane Valley. But even in the city of Spokane itself, it was not very thinly disguised. They didn't even try to hide the anti-black sentiment. Even on campus, I knew the only 2 non-black students who weren't on the basketball team. Every other black student on campus was on the basketball team. And they all lived in one dorm. And that was by intention. All the university said it was because to keep the team together, but it was commonly seen as keeping them away from us. And so I think we really need to be, you know, think about, you know, Seattle isn't Washington.
But to you know, and Corey's point about thinking about the statistics here in Seattle or Washington, or you know why they might be as bad as they are, it just doesn't feel. It feels like it can't be good. That it can't be good that people, that black people have fewer folks with whom to commiserate, with whom to sort of get angry and be upset. And, you know, I don't know, it feels like, you know, it's to mix is a good, it feels like it would be it's a good thing, you know, one learns about one another, but if black people here in Seattle are just mixing and assimilating, you know, then, and to be not to assimilating, meaning to be like white people, then, you know, we're not learning, you know, the struggle. We're not as exposed to the struggle in the same way. You know, I wasn't exposed to that struggle. I mean, I didn't allow myself to be as exposed or understand the struggle as much until I kind of, it was more in my face. It just feels like it can't be good. Like, and maybe that is why it's folks do poorly here in Seattle too.
You mean assimilating can't be good?
Well, you know, mixing to me is, I don't know, assimilate is a different word. And if assimilation means be more like white people, that doesn't seem like a good idea. Or to expect that. But mixing feels like it's a good thing if we learn from each other. But if that means it's really about you know, tamping down a struggle and not being able to talk about it or have, you know, people like oneself to talk about it, to struggle, to fight, to be angry. That seems like a bad thing. That seems like that would internalize that struggle for people. And maybe it shows up in their schoolwork, shows up in other ways.
Verlon, you want to give a final thought, and then we'll go ahead and close off. We're at 9:55.
I think that white people think there's something wrong with Black people. They think, why can't they get a grip? You know, why can't they do this? Why can't they do that? And they think that there's something wrong with us, something within our makeup that makes it difficult for us to get along and get on board and become parts of society. But at the same time, they're neglecting the fact that we're continually pushing people out, pushing people of color out. And I think that's what we have to come to grips with. Why do you think Black people, something's wrong with us? And why do you continue pushing us out? Why do you continue, as Robin DiAngelo said, get these spaces with non-Blacks? You continually seek out spaces that are all white, and you're not interested in spaces that you know, that have Black people in them. So, but I think talking like this is a good thing, and you know, putting it out there is you know, is a good thing.
Great. Thank you, Pastor Verlon. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close the meeting so that we can finish the recording. And then if you can just pop back on in like 1 minute for church. Hopefully we'll see everybody here for church. But we wanted to close the recording so we can post just this part and then start a new recording for our service. So we'll see everybody in a few minutes. And there'll be an announcement of more to come after church too.
1 second, Nancy, if you're on the line, please just call back in. You're gonna get cut off, but call back in, Nancy, okay?
All right. Thank you.